Everyone trusted my grandfather, calm, respected, untouchable. While my grandmother was still setting the table, he was already replacing her. I didn't confront him in private, I waited. And when I spoke, the whole family heard the truth at once. Some men don't need forgiveness. They need witnesses. They used that word about me my whole life. Too much. Too loud when I laughed. Too sharp when I spoke. Too alive for a house that worshipped silence. In our family, silence meant safety. Order meant morality. And my grandfather was the high priest of both. Everything in his house had a place. Chairs aligned, clocks synced, voices lowered the moment he entered a room. Nothing chaotic survived him for long. I tried. God, I tried. I learned to sit straighter, to speak later, to swallow reactions before they embarrassed someone, usually him. My grandmother would squeeze my wrist under the table. Not hard, just enough. A warning. Not for my sake, for hers. Because when I was too much, he became colder, sharper, more precise, and she paid for it in silence. Back then, I thought I was the problem, that my emotions disrupted something sacred. Now I understand the truth. I wasn't too much. I was the only thing in that house that refused to shrink. And men like him can forgive many things, but never that. Everyone trusted my grandfather, not because he was kind, because he was calm. He spoke slowly. He listened just long enough. He nodded like a verdict. People mistook that for wisdom. At family gatherings, he sat at the center of the table without trying. Conversations bent toward him. Decisions waited for his approval. He never demanded control. He designed rooms where control happened naturally. When he looked at you, you felt evaluated, not judged, measured, useful or unnecessary. I used to think he was an anchor, something solid in a loud world, a man who kept chaos out. But anchors don't just hold ships in place, they keep them from leaving. He smiled at me the way you smile at a noise you can't turn off. Patient, tight. When I talked too fast, he corrected my tone. When I laughed too loud, he changed the subject. When I asked questions, he answered something else. Always polite, always controlled. Nothing about him was violent. And that's what made him dangerous. Because no one ever suspects the man who looks like order. Routine was his favorite weapon, because it never looked like one. Breakfast at the same minute every morning, the radio at the same volume, the same chair, the same silence. My grandmother learned the rhythm by heart, not because she liked it, because missing a beat had consequences. If dinner was late, he sighed. If salt wasn't on the table, he paused. If she spoke out of turn, he smiled. Correction disguised as patience. She adjusted herself constantly. Her voice first, then her posture, then her opinions. Eventually, her wants stopped showing up at all. People said she was calm. They said marriage had softened her. They said she was lucky. They didn't see what routine does when it tightens. Every repeated day made her smaller, more efficient, less visible. She moved through the house like an apology. Quiet, careful, predictable. He called it stability. I watched it become dependency, because when everything is scheduled, even your breathing stops feeling like it belongs to you. And once a woman forgets her own rhythm, a man like him doesn't need to raise his voice. The silence does it for him. My grandmother never said she was unhappy. She didn't need to. Her body spoke for her. Her hands shook when she poured tea, even when the cup was steady. Her shoulders flinched before he corrected her, like muscle memory learned too well. She smiled too early, apologized too fast, stopped mid-sentence without realizing it. That's what control looks like when it settles into flesh. He never yelled, never hit, never threatened. He just watched. And when someone is watched long enough, they begin to police themselves. She folded inward year by year, her clothes darker, her movements smaller, her presence thinner. Family said she was peaceful now. That age had softened her. That marriage had grounded her. They mistook submission for serenity. I saw her at night, standing in the kitchen, lights off, hands resting on the counter, as if she needed to remember where she ended. I wanted to scream for her, shake her, break the quiet. But she had survived by becoming quiet. And men like him don't need obedience spoken aloud. They recognize it instantly. It's the sound of a woman forgetting she ever had a voice. I didn't catch him in bed. There was no dramatic reveal. It was worse than that. It was small, casual, careless. A smell on his jacket that didn't belong to our house. Too sweet, too alive. A neighbor's laugh through a wall that was supposed to be solid. A pause when he said her name. Just a fraction too long. He stopped locking his phone. Stopped pretending to be careful. Because men like him don't fear being exposed. They fear being challenged. I watched my grandmother serve him dinner that night. Watched her place the plate perfectly in front of him. Watched her wait for his nod before sitting down. And suddenly everything aligned. The routine, the silence, the shrinking. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't passion. It wasn't loneliness. It was entitlement. He believed order made him invisible, that being respected meant being untouchable. I felt something crack inside me, not heartbreak, not shock, clarity. I understood then. He didn't betray my grandmother. He replaced her, quietly, conveniently, the way you replace furniture once it stops matching the room. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I went quiet. Not the kind of quiet my grandmother learned. Not shrinking. Not surrender. This was the quiet that sharpens. I replayed everything. Every dinner. Every correction. Every moment my grandmother disappeared a little more while he stayed intact. I watched how he moved through the world, how people leaned toward him, how his name opened doors before he even spoke. That's when I understood what he truly valued. Not love, not loyalty, control, reputation. He built his life like a display case, clean, impressive, untouchable. So I stopped reacting, stopped signaling anger, stopped being too much. I became precise. I learned when to listen and when to store information away. I learned which family members talked, which ones stayed silent, which ones worshipped him the hardest. He thought my calm meant defeat, that I had finally learned my place. He was wrong. I wasn't calming down. I was choosing the angle. And once you see the structure clearly, bringing it down becomes a matter of timing, not emotion, timing. I didn't rush. Men like him don't fall from explosions. They collapse from exposure. I started collecting without being seen. Dates, patterns, small inconsistencies he assumed no one tracked. He loved documentation, schedules, proof. So I learned his language. I noticed when he stayed longer at the neighbor's house than he admitted. When his stories changed, depending on who was listening. When his version of events needed correcting. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. Soft ones. Harmless ones. I listened while others filled the silence for him. Family members, friends, people who trusted him too much to protect him properly. That's the thing about men obsessed with reputation. They build their own witnesses. I chose the moment carefully. A gathering he couldn't skip. A room full of people who believed in him. Public, clean, unavoidable. No screaming, no theatrics. Just enough truth, spoken clearly, to make sure no one could pretend they didn't hear it. He thought control meant preparation. He never considered someone else might be preparing too, and that was his mistake. It was a family gathering, the kind he loved. Food laid out perfectly, laughter timed just right, everyone present. He was relaxed, at ease, certain of the role he played. I waited until the room settled, until forks slowed, until attention drifted naturally to him. Then I stood up. No shaking, no rage. I spoke the way he taught everyone else to speak. Slow, clear, controlled. I named dates, not accusations, timelines. I mentioned doors that closed too late at night, visits that didn't match the stories, details that aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. I didn't look at him. I looked at the table. That's what made them listen. Someone laughed at first, nervously. Then I said her name, the neighbor. Silence snapped into place. He finally looked at me, really looked. For the first time, he didn't recognize the room anymore, because truth doesn't need volume, it only needs witnesses. And once a room hears it together, There is no polite way to give control back. I watched his face change in real time. Not anger, not outrage, calculation. He searched the room for alignment, for support, for someone to restore the balance he depended on. No one moved. His mouth opened, then closed again. Once, twice. He tried to speak carefully, the way he always did. But control only works when the room agrees to participate. Someone shifted in their chair. Another looked down at their plate. A third stared at the wall like it suddenly mattered. He realized it then. The silence wasn't his anymore. Every explanation he considered would only confirm what I'd already placed between them. Facts don't argue. They sit there, heavy. He smiled reflexively, the same smile he used to correct my tone, to smooth tension, to reset the room. It didn't work, because smiles require permission too. For the first time in my life, I saw him without the structure protecting him. Just a man, exposed, measured, useful, or unnecessary. And this time, he wasn't the one deciding. I didn't wait for apologies. They weren't for me anyway. The room stayed quiet long after I sat down. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that rearranges people. My grandmother didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Something in her posture shifted, not relief, permission. She stood up later that night without asking anyone. Left the table early, no explanation, no one stopped her. That's how I knew it worked. Families don't change in loud moments. They change when silence chooses a new owner. He avoided my eyes after that, not out of shame, out of recognition. He finally understood what it feels like to be seen without consent. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear, lighter, like a room with windows opened after years of controlled air. He thought he could replace her quietly, erase her without consequence. I made sure the entire family learned the truth together. And once they did, forgetting became impossible. Some men lose control in private. I made him lose it where it mattered most, in front of everyone. I didn't find out my husband was cheating the way people expect. There were no messages, no confessions. I noticed something worse. He stopped reacting to me. And my mother started finishing my sentences. I have always been described as too much. Too loud in the mornings. Too colorful in my choices. Too emotional in rooms where silence was preferred. I moved through life like a spill, uncontained, unapologetic, alive. I talked with my hands. I changed my mind often. I filled spaces instead of blending into them. The world I came from did not like that. It liked clean lines, neutral tones, predictable routines. My mother's house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Nothing was misplaced. Nothing raised its voice. Even laughter sounded measured, as if joy itself needed permission. I learned early that order could be a weapon, that silence could dominate more efficiently than shouting. Still, I resisted. I painted my rooms. I rearranged furniture at midnight. I stayed messy on purpose, as if disorder could protect me from becoming invisible. I did not yet understand that control does not always arrive aggressively. Sometimes it arrives smiling, calm, beige, offering safety, and sometimes it looks like love. My mother never yelled. She never needed to. Her power lived in routine, in expectation, in the way people adjusted themselves around her without being asked. She didn't demand space. She assumed it. Every room rearranged itself subtly when she entered. Growing up, I learned that boundaries in our house were flexible, but only in one direction. Hers extended everywhere. Mine ended where her comfort began. She knew everything before I said it, finished my sentences, corrected my memories. I was never outright silenced, just slowly overwritten. She called it care, concern, experience. I learned to doubt my reactions before trusting them. If something felt wrong, she would gently explain why it wasn't. And if I still felt it, then the problem was my sensitivity, my excess. Love, in her world, was proximity without permission, involvement without invitation. She was always there, always watching, always justifying her presence as necessary. By the time I left home, I thought I wanted distance. What I really wanted was air. I didn't yet know how familiar suffocation could feel when it returned wearing a different face. When I met my husband, he felt like the opposite of chaos. He spoke slowly. He listened without interrupting. His apartment looked like a magazine page, neutral, quiet, intentional. Nothing accidental, nothing loud. Being near him felt like stepping out of static and into calm. He called me vibrant, said he admired how alive I was. He liked watching me talk, watching me move. I mistook his stillness for stability, his restraint for strength. He felt like an anchor, something solid I could rest against without losing myself. At first, his calm softened me. I slept better. I planned more. I slowed down. It felt mutual, balanced, like two people meeting in the middle. But there were moments, small ones, where I noticed he preferred things a certain way. How my spontaneity unsettled him. How he corrected details casually. How his approval felt conditional on my ability to adjust. I ignored it. After all, calm felt safer than noise, and I had grown up believing that adapting was love. The shift wasn't dramatic. It never is. It happened in suggestions, not demands. In looks, not arguments. In praise when I complied, and quiet when I didn't. He liked me better when I was predictable, when I planned ahead, when I spoke less intensely. Slowly, my colors dulled. I wore neutrals without realizing it. I stopped rearranging furniture. I asked before changing things that used to be mine. He called it maturity, growth, stability, and I believed him because I wanted the peace he promised. I noticed I was apologizing more, not for actions, but for reactions, for feeling too deeply, for caring too much, for needing space. I was still present, but smaller, more contained, easier to manage. What I didn't see yet was that his calm wasn't neutral. It required maintenance. And I was the one maintaining it, piece by piece, quietly trading my scale for harmony. By the time I realized I had shrunk, he was already comfortable with the version of me that took up less room. The signs didn't arrive as red flags. They arrived as patterns, familiar ones, the same controlled silence, the same subtle authority, the same feeling of being observed rather than partnered. I noticed how he deferred to my mother, how quickly their conversations aligned, how naturally they spoke about me instead of to me. It was subtle, shared glances, mutual understanding, decisions made in my absence and presented as care. I told myself I was imagining it, that my history was coloring my perception, that I was projecting old wounds onto new relationships. Still, something felt rehearsed, too seamless, as if they shared a language I wasn't fluent in. I felt like a guest in my own life, watching interactions that seemed designed to exclude me without ever openly doing so. I didn't confront. I observed. I collected details. I watched how order tightened around me, and in that watching, something inside me stopped shrinking. It went still instead, calculating, remembering who I was before I learned to disappear. I didn't find out through a confession. There was no dramatic reveal, no messages left open, no raised voices. I discovered the truth through alignment, through the way stories matched too perfectly, through schedules that overlapped conveniently, through silence that felt practiced, through the unmistakable familiarity of control returning in a shape I recognized too well. When I understood what was happening, my first reaction wasn't pain. It was clarity. Everything made sense. The calm, the order, the way I had been reduced. They didn't betray me out of passion. They replaced me out of efficiency. I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I didn't collapse. I analyzed. I understood the system they thought they were running quietly. And I realized something important. They believed invisibility was the same as absence. They believed silence meant safety. They were wrong. I didn't rush. I didn't lash out. I planned the way they lived, carefully, methodically, within structure. I used their values against them: reputation, order, appearances, the story they needed the world to believe. I gathered proof, not to expose intimacy, but to expose pattern, control, appropriation, replacement. I chose the setting deliberately: neutral, respectable, public. a space where calm was expected and disruption felt unforgivable, unless it was justified. I rehearsed nothing emotional. I prepared facts, timelines, documentation, the kind of truth that doesn't need volume to land. They thought I was quiet because I was broken. In reality, I was aligning my voice with precision. This wasn't revenge fueled by rage, it was reclamation. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was making sure they could never pretend I didn't exist. I invited them separately. No hints, no tension, just politeness, normalcy, the kind that disarms. They arrived confident, composed, in control. Sitting side by side, they looked exactly as they always had, aligned, calm, unbothered. I let the silence stretch. I spoke slowly, clearly. I didn't accuse, I described. I laid out the sequence of choices they thought were invisible. I watched their faces shift as recognition replaced comfort. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult. I named. There is something terrifying about being seen accurately when you rely on silence to survive. Others listened. The room changed. Order cracked. I didn't need to humiliate them. I simply refused to protect them anymore. What followed wasn't chaos. It was stillness, the kind that feels heavy, irreversible. Their authority collapsed quietly. No shouting, no defense that sounded convincing. Control does not survive transparency. I watched them realize that the narrative they curated no longer belonged to them, that the calm they hid behind now worked against them. This wasn't decapitation by force. It was removal of power, symbolic, complete. I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. After it was over, there was no celebration, no relief that felt explosive, just space, real space, the kind I hadn't occupied in years. I noticed how quiet the world became when I stopped shrinking myself to fit it. I didn't rush to rebuild. I didn't explain my choices to anyone. I let the silence belong to me for once. Not the controlled silence they preferred, but the honest kind that comes after truth has been spoken and nothing is left to negotiate. I began taking up room again, emotionally first, then physically. I spoke without checking how it would land. I laughed louder. I allowed myself to be inconvenient. I stopped translating my needs into something easier for others to digest. They lost their power the moment I stopped protecting their version of reality. What replaced it wasn't revenge. It was clarity. He believed he could replace me quietly, without consequence, without memory. I didn't destroy him. I didn't need to. I simply returned to myself, fully, visibly, irreversibly, and that made me impossible to erase. I didn't catch messages. I noticed routines. My best friend from high school knew his schedule better than I did. Plans were made without me. He didn't cheat in chaos. He cheated in order. And that's when I realized I wasn't betrayed. I was replaced. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern didn't announce itself all at once. It clarified slowly through repetition that no longer felt accidental. I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. The question became irrelevant. What mattered was consistency. Every adjustment pointed in the same direction. My presence no longer altered outcomes. Plans existed independently of my awareness. I learned about them after they were completed, never before. That detail stayed constant. There was no concealment involved. If I asked, he explained calmly, as if briefing someone external. His tone never shifted. It wasn't defensive or dismissive. It was procedural. I realized that inclusion had been replaced with notification. I was no longer part of the decision loop. I was an endpoint. The system didn't need my input to function. It accounted for me only as a variable to work around. That understanding arrived without emotion. It felt technical, almost neutral, like recognizing a process map that no longer contains your role. Once identified, it became visible everywhere, in conversations, in timing, in how space was allocated. Nothing dramatic confirmed it. The absence of contradiction did. I started noticing how little explanation was required anymore. Questions that once felt necessary no longer formed, not because answers were available, but because they were irrelevant. I observed my own behavior the way you watch a system stabilize. Inputs reduced, outputs remained consistent. The structure no longer depended on my engagement. I was present, but not consulted, and that distinction held steady. I noticed it in how time was allocated. Mornings unfolded without coordination. Evenings overlapped without intention. We shared space, not direction. There was no discomfort in it once I stopped resisting the configuration. Resistance implied an alternative still existed. It didn't. The process had already settled into its final form. I paid attention to details instead of meanings. Doors opening and closing, lights turned off without comment, schedules updating without notification. Each action reinforced the same conclusion. Nothing was being taken away, nothing was being added. I had simply been moved outside the operational core. That realization didn't demand a response. It required acknowledgement. Once acknowledged, it stopped pressing against me. The quiet felt intentional, not empty. I stopped trying to remember when it started. The exact point didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the structure no longer depended on me. I noticed how little effort it took to remain where I was. No decisions required my confirmation. No plans waited for my response. I existed in the margins without resistance. That position felt strangely stable, not temporary, not unresolved, finished. I understood that whatever role I thought I still had was historical. It belonged to an earlier version of the system. The current one functioned without it. Once that became clear, the tension dissolved. There was nothing to fix and nothing to recover, only a position to recognize. I stayed quiet because quiet was already built in. The realization didn't arrive as shock. There was no confrontation, no confession, no dramatic discovery. It arrived as a pattern. I noticed how their calendars aligned too perfectly, how conversations stopped when I entered the room, how he repeated phrases she used, word for word, as if rehearsed. Efficiency has a texture. It feels smooth, optimized, almost professional. What they had didn't feel passionate. It felt coordinated. I didn't ask questions. I watched. I listened. I let the information arrange itself. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't betrayal driven by desire. It was replacement driven by convenience. She fit the structure I had been sanding myself to match. She required less translation, less emotional negotiation, less disruption. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity, the kind that settles in your chest like weight, not fire. I realized Jacob hadn't cheated on me in chaos. He had cheated in routine, in shared habits, in parallel lives. And suddenly, everything made sense. The shrinking wasn't accidental. It was preparation. I didn't confront them immediately. Control collapses fastest when it believes it's invisible. I kept behaving as expected. Calm, cooperative, predictable. Inside, I was mapping exits. I examined what Jacob valued most: reputation, composure, the image of rational decency. He wanted to be seen as fair, measured, reasonable. My friend valued belonging, being chosen, being correct. Their connection depended on remaining quiet, efficient, unquestioned. So I gave them exactly that. Silence, time, space. I let them grow comfortable. People are careless when they think they are undiscovered. I documented patterns, dates, overlaps, the subtle arrogance of people who believe they are smarter than emotion. I didn't plan revenge as destruction. I planned it as exposure, not explosive, but undeniable. Control hates unpredictability. Order collapses when observed publicly. I didn't want them ashamed. I wanted them clearly seen. There's a difference. I chose a gallery opening because art speaks without shouting. It invites witnesses. It frames truth without begging for belief. I invited them separately. Neutral messages, polite tone, no urgency. When they arrived and saw each other, I watched the calculations begin. Jacob tried to regain control through composure. My friend froze, waiting for instruction. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I stood in front of an installation about repetition and absence, and I spoke. I described a relationship built on adjustment, a woman learning to reduce herself for harmony, a man mistaking silence for compatibility. I spoke clinically, observationally. People listened because I wasn't asking for sympathy. I was presenting a case. Then I said the sentence I had rehearsed only once. He didn't cheat in a storm. He cheated in a schedule. The room understood. Order hates being named. Jacob tried to respond. He used calm language, reasonable words, the tone he had always trusted. But calm doesn't erase pattern. It highlights it. My friend avoided eye contact. She always had when things became real. I didn't look at either of them. I addressed the room. I talked about how control often masquerades as care, how order rewards compliance, how women are taught to mistake reduction for growth. This wasn't about love lost. It was about voice recovered. I didn't reveal messages. I didn't need evidence theatrics. Recognition is louder than proof. People saw what they needed to see because the structure had been explained. Jacob's reputation fractured not through scandal, but through understanding. That's harder to repair. Silence followed, not the kind that disciplines, the kind that releases. After that night, I didn't feel victorious. I felt spacious. My body expanded back into itself. My thoughts grew messy again. I stopped explaining my reactions. I stopped translating my needs. Control had required constant self-monitoring. Freedom felt disorienting at first. I missed the predictability. That surprised me. Then I understood. Order is addictive when you've been trained to depend on it. But addiction fades when the source is removed. My friend never contacted me again. Jacob sent one message. It was calm, apologetic, carefully worded. I didn't respond. Closure wasn't owed. I wasn't angry. Anger would have kept me tethered. I had already stepped out of the structure they shared. I was no longer an element to be managed. People asked if it hurt. Of course it did. But pain wasn't the lesson. Precision was. I learned how quietly people can be replaced when they make themselves small. I learned how easily control hides behind kindness. I learned that not all betrayals feel violent. Some feel administrative. That knowledge changed me. I stopped romanticizing stability. I stopped apologizing for intensity. Chaos isn't the opposite of order. Suppression is. I began choosing spaces that welcomed movement, people who didn't require explanation, relationships that didn't reward silence. My voice returned not as a scream, but as volume, as presence, as refusal to disappear politely. I became visible again, to myself first. Jacob thought he could replace me quietly. He thought efficiency would erase memory. He was wrong. I didn't destroy his life. I clarified it. I didn't take revenge. I took authorship. I am still too much, too emotional, too alive. But now I know the cost of shrinking, and I refuse to pay it again. I wasn't edited out. I stepped out of the frame and rewrote it. Being unforgettable isn't about noise. It's about leaving no doubt that you existed fully, loudly, and on your own terms. I didn't cheat because I stopped loving my husband. I cheated because I thought I would never get caught. That was the moment everything ended. I just didn't know it yet. I have always been someone with too much happening inside. My thoughts never stood in neat lines. They crowded each other, overlapping, demanding attention all at once. I felt things in color and motion, not in order. Silence made me restless. Routine made me feel smaller than I was. I didn't see that as a flaw. I thought it meant I was alive. My husband lived differently. His world was quiet and beige, measured and predictable. He woke up at the same time every morning, folded his clothes the same way, planned his weeks before they began. Being with him felt safe, not exciting, safe. At first, I mistook that safety for balance. I thought we completed each other. My chaos softened against his structure. His calm steadied my noise. People said we worked well together, and I believed them. What I didn't realize then was that balance slowly turned into containment, and I didn't notice the moment when I stopped expanding and started fitting myself into his order. Our life looked perfect from the outside. We had habits, shared responsibilities, quiet evenings that passed without conflict. We rarely fought. We rarely raised our voices. Everything functioned. But function is not the same as feeling. Over time, I learned how to take up less space. I spoke more carefully. I chose words that wouldn't disrupt the calm. I edited myself before he ever needed to. It wasn't something he demanded outright. It was something I learned by watching his reactions. The slight pause, the polite silence, the way chaos made him uncomfortable. I told myself this was maturity, that passion naturally fades into routine, that marriage was supposed to be steady, not loud. Still, there were moments, small, quiet ones, when I felt invisible even while sitting right next to him, like I was present, but not fully seen. I didn't blame him. He never did anything wrong. That made it harder. There was no villain, no clear fracture, just a slow erosion I didn't know how to name. The emptiness didn't arrive suddenly. It settled in like dust. Thin layers, invisible until they covered everything. I stopped recognizing myself in small ways. I stopped wearing certain colors. I stopped talking about ideas that felt too messy. I stopped asking questions that didn't have practical answers. I learned to live inside margins. My husband loved me in his way. He showed up. He was reliable. He assumed that stability was enough. Maybe for him it was. For me, something was missing. But I couldn't explain what without sounding ungrateful. So I didn't try. When someone else noticed me, it wasn't dramatic. There was no spark, no cinematic moment, just attention. He listened without correcting me. He laughed at things my husband found unnecessary. He looked at me like I was still unfolding, not finished. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was harmless, that I deserved to feel visible again. I didn't call it a warning, I called it relief. I didn't plan to cheat. I didn't wake up one morning intending to destroy my marriage. It happened quietly, without urgency. Conversations lingered longer than they should have. Messages felt lighter than home. I noticed how easy it was to be myself again when nothing was expected of me. That ease felt like freedom. I convinced myself I was reclaiming something I had lost, that it was about me, not about my husband. I avoided words like betrayal. I avoided thinking about consequences. I focused on how alive I felt in those moments, how quickly the noise inside me softened. There was no passion worth romanticizing, no love story, just an escape from the version of myself I had learned to live as. When it finally crossed the line, it didn't feel explosive. It felt muted, almost disappointing. I remember thinking that this was it, that this was the thing I had been missing. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't finding myself. I was just avoiding the truth. Afterward, there was no relief, no clarity, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't calm you, it exposes you. I went home and saw my husband moving through our shared space with the same steady rhythm. Nothing had changed for him. Everything had changed for me. I noticed details I had ignored before, the way he trusted me without question, the way our life existed because we both protected it. The weight of that protection hit me all at once. I didn't feel empowered. I felt small, smaller than I had ever felt in our marriage. The attention I had chased evaporated the moment it was no longer new. What remained was the reality I had tried to escape. Only now it carried damage I had caused myself. I understood then that what I called freedom was just distance, and distance doesn't fix emptiness. It multiplies it. I hadn't reclaimed my voice. I had just drowned it out temporarily. Guilt didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as clarity. I saw my actions without excuses, without metaphors, without the comfort of self-justification. My husband had not trapped me. He had not silenced me. I had chosen quiet over honesty. I had chosen avoidance over conversation. I had chosen the illusion of being seen over the work of being known. That realization was unbearable because it left me without someone to blame. I wanted to believe my mistake meant something profound, that it revealed a hidden truth about my marriage. But it didn't. It only revealed my unwillingness to face discomfort directly. Cheating didn't solve anything. It didn't give me answers. It didn't give me courage. It just delayed responsibility. I understood then that mistakes don't always come from cruelty. Sometimes they come from fear, from the inability to ask for more without knowing if you're allowed to receive it. And I had been afraid for a very long time. Living with the secret was heavier than the dissatisfaction that came before it. Every ordinary moment carried an aftertaste of dishonesty. I watched my husband speak about plans, about future routines, about a life he assumed was intact. Each word felt like a mirror held up to what I had fractured. I didn't feel trapped anymore. I felt accountable. I realized that the version of myself I missed, the loud, colorful, expansive woman, was never taken from me. I had slowly abandoned her to keep the peace, and instead of reclaiming her honestly, I had betrayed the one person who trusted me the most. That truth didn't free me, it grounded me. I saw how easy it is to mistake attention for understanding, how dangerous it is to seek validation instead of communication. The mistake wasn't falling for someone else. The mistake was believing that escape could replace responsibility. There was no redemption in that. Only the knowledge that some choices cannot be undone, only acknowledged. I stopped romanticizing what happened. I stopped telling myself it was inevitable. It wasn't. It was a decision I made because it was easier than speaking up, because it allowed me to avoid the risk of being misunderstood, rejected, or asked to change. I began to see my marriage clearly, not as a prison, not as perfection, but as a structure I had participated in building. I had helped create the silence I resented. That realization didn't absolve me. It stripped me of illusions. I understood that growth doesn't come from secrecy. It comes from exposure, from difficult conversations, from staying present when discomfort arrives. I didn't feel proud of myself. I didn't feel stronger. I felt honest. And honesty, I learned, is not empowering in the way stories promise. It's heavy. It demands ownership without applause. I had made a mistake, not a poetic one, not a necessary one, just a human one, with consequences that belonged entirely to me. I don't tell this story to justify myself. I tell it because it's easy to mistake silence for oppression and restlessness for truth. I thought I had lost my voice. In reality, I had avoided using it where it mattered most. Cheating didn't make me braver. It revealed how afraid I was to ask for change directly. I learned that responsibility doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives quietly, when you stop running. My husband remains a part of this story not as a villain, but as a reminder of what trust looks like when it's unguarded, and how fragile that trust really is. I don't believe mistakes define us forever, but they do clarify who we are willing to become afterward. What I did didn't fix my life. It fractured it, and understanding that was the moment I stopped lying to myself. Sometimes the hardest realization is not that you were hurt, but that you were the one who caused the harm. I used to think being too much was my problem. Now I know the real problem was not knowing how to hold that too much with honesty. I don't see myself as a victim of routine anymore. I see myself as someone who made a choice instead of a conversation. There is no triumph in this ending, no empowerment arc, just awareness. I learned that mistakes don't always teach you how to move forward. Sometimes they only teach you what not to do again. If I could rewrite the past, I wouldn't choose differently. I would speak earlier. I would risk discomfort instead of betrayal. I understand now that being seen by someone new is easy. Being known by someone who has watched you change is harder. What I did was an error born from avoidance, not desire. And living with that truth is quieter than guilt, heavier than regret, and more honest than any excuse I ever made. I didn't catch him cheating. I caught him replacing me. She corrected me at my own family dinner. He stayed silent. That's when I knew this wasn't an affair. It was removal. I realized I was already gone at a family dinner, not in bed, not through messages. At the table, where everyone was smiling. My mother was talking about work. Someone laughed. He sat across from me, calm, composed, correct. And then she, my mother's friend, corrected me. He doesn't eat it like that. Not sharply, not loudly, like someone who knows. I looked at him. He kept cutting the meat, even, methodical. He didn't look surprised. He didn't disagree. He didn't look at me. The plates were perfectly aligned. The wine had been opened in advance. The lighting was exactly how he liked it. I was sitting in my own home, feeling like a guest. Not betrayed, replaced. She knew his habits. She knew his rhythm. She knew him better than I did in that moment. And the worst part, no one at the table noticed anything strange, except me. I had always been told I was too much, too emotional, too loud, too intense. I filled rooms without trying. I spoke with my hands. I laughed before finishing sentences. I lived like silence was something to fight. He watched me like a system watches chaos. Patient, calm, waiting for correction. He never said change. He said, "This works better." He never said stop. He said, "You'll thank me later." With him, order felt like safety. At first, he chose restaurants, schedules, timelines. He framed it as care. "You're bad with structure. I'll handle it. Relax." So I did. I let him decide, then confirm, then correct. I started asking before speaking, checking my tone, editing myself mid-sentence. Not because I was weak, because the system rewarded silence. He called it balance. He called it maturity. I didn't notice when my voice became optional, until someone else started using it. The shift was quiet. So quiet I didn't register it as danger. At first, we decided things together. Then he prepared options. Then he chose the best one. Then he stopped asking. He remembered dates, passwords, deadlines. I let him. He liked efficiency. He liked predictability. He liked knowing outcomes in advance. When I reacted emotionally, he didn't argue. He waited. Silence was his favorite tool. Not punishment, calibration. If I pushed too hard, the room cooled. If I spoke too long, he checked his watch. If I cried, he stayed still until I apologized for crying. He never said I was dramatic. He let me say it first. I began rehearsing conversations before having them, editing myself in my head, cutting anything that might sound excessive. I stopped bringing problems to him, then ideas, then questions. Balance became dependence. Dependence became routine. And routine did what shouting never could. It made my absence feel normal. The dinner didn't explode. That's what made it dangerous. She didn't flirt. She didn't cross lines. She didn't even look at him too much. She corrected details. How he likes his food. When he prefers silence. What order things should happen in. Small things. Private things. Each time, he let it pass. No surprise. No denial. No glance in my direction. That was the fracture. I watched him allow her knowledge. Watched him accept her accuracy. Watched the system recognize a compatible input. I didn't accuse. I didn't interrupt. I listened. My body reacted before my mind caught up. Heat in my face. Pressure in my chest. A scream stuck behind my teeth. But I didn't scream. I analyzed. She wasn't the problem. She was the result. He hadn't betrayed me suddenly. He had replaced me gradually. The realization wasn't loud. It was clean. Precise. And once you see the structure, you stop asking why it hurts. You start asking where to cut. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't cry in the bathroom. I didn't ask for explanations. That would have been emotional. And emotions were the one thing he discounted. I waited. I watched how he moved through the house, how confident he was in routine, how certain he was that silence meant consent. He believed stability protected him, that predictability was armor. So I started learning his language, not feelings, systems. I checked calendars, shared folders, access permissions. I noticed overlaps, meetings that didn't require him, decisions that bypassed protocol, nothing illegal, just incorrect. He trusted order more than people. So I touched the order. I stopped reacting. I started collecting. Dates, names, connections. He mistook my calm for surrender. He relaxed. That was the moment I knew. He thought the danger had passed. He didn't realize I had finally stopped trying to be heard. I was preparing to be precise. The second dinner was planned by him. Family again. Order again. Safety. He liked repeating successful patterns. The table was set the same way. Same plates. Same wine. Same lighting. She was there again. Quiet. Correct. I waited until everyone was seated, until he relaxed into his role. Then I asked a simple question, not loud, not emotional. Who approved her access? Silence. He blinked once, not panic, calculation. I didn't accuse, I listed dates, shared folders, calendar overlaps, decisions made outside protocol. I didn't look at him, I looked at the table. I just want to understand how this passed review. He tried to smile, tried to frame it as misunderstanding. I kept going. Each fact landed clean. No adjectives, no anger. The room shifted, not toward me, away from him. She didn't speak. He realized too late what I'd done. I hadn't exposed an affair. I had exposed unreliability. And in his world, that was fatal. The reaction didn't come immediately. That was expected. People like him don't collapse loudly. They recalculate. Someone asked for clarification. Someone else checked their phone. A fork stopped midair. He tried to regain structure. Suggested we talk later. Privately. No one agreed. Questions followed. Not emotional ones. Operational ones. Why was access granted without approval? Why dates didn't align? Why procedures were skipped? He answered calmly. Too calmly. The more he explained, the worse it sounded. Not criminal, just careless. Carelessness is unforgivable to people who value order. She kept her eyes on her plate, didn't defend him, didn't deny anything. That mattered. By the end of dinner, nothing was resolved. But something was broken. Not our relationship, his credibility. When we stood up, conversations shifted away from him. Plans changed tone. Trust recalibrated. He walked me to the door like nothing had happened, but his hand hesitated on the handle. For the first time, the system wasn't sure what came next, and systems hate uncertainty. After that dinner, nothing dramatic happened, which was the point. No messages, no confrontations, no apologies, just distance. Meetings stopped including him. Emails came later. Decisions were made without his input. He noticed patterns before people. That was his strength. He asked if something was wrong. I said I hadn't seen anything unusual, which was true. She disappeared quietly. No invitations, no calls, no explanations. Not punished. Removed. At home, the system kept running. Schedules, silence, routine. But now it worked against him. He started explaining things I hadn't questioned, justifying decisions no one challenged. I listened, nodded, said very little. He tried to reassert order, rebuild predictability. But trust doesn't return the way silence does. It doesn't slide back into place. It requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was the one thing he couldn't afford. I wasn't angry. I wasn't emotional. I had become unreadable. And for someone who controlled outcomes, that was the first real loss. The silence didn't scare me anymore. It clarified things. I stopped adjusting my tone, stopped timing my words, stopped asking if now was a good moment. I spoke when I had something to say, and I finished my sentences. He noticed the change immediately. Systems always do. He asked if I was upset. I said no, because I wasn't. I started taking up space again, leaving lights on, changing plans without explanation, making decisions that didn't require his approval. Not to provoke him, to exist. He tried to restore balance, suggested routines, offered structure. I declined. I wasn't rebelling. I was opting out. People around us adjusted quickly. They always do when someone stops shrinking. He became careful around me, measured, uncertain. For the first time, he couldn't predict my reactions, couldn't model outcomes. I wasn't chaotic. I was free of his framework. And without a framework, his calm stopped looking like strength. It looked like hesitation. He thought he could replace me quietly. That was the mistake. He believed removal was enough, that if I stopped reacting, I would disappear. But silence isn't absence. It's space. And space belongs to whoever fills it. I didn't expose him emotionally. I didn't shame him. I didn't ask for justice. I let his own rules measure him. Order turned against him. Routine stopped protecting him. Predictability revealed its limits. People didn't turn on him. They simply stopped leaning toward him, which was worse. I didn't need to explain myself. The system understood. I returned to my full volume, my full pace, my full presence. Not loudly, not aggressively, decisively. He still sits the same way, speaks the same way, cuts his food the same way. But now, when I speak, the room adjusts to me. He wanted quiet substitution, efficiency, no disruption. I made sure that wasn't possible. I didn't take revenge, I reclaimed authorship, and I was never replaceable.